there's going to be noises from me getting cough drops, I apologize in advance. Okay. I think we're about to be live. I think we are live. Hi, everyone. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, all you wonderful people out there in the chat. Sorry we're late. You were so nice waiting for us. My name is Bryant Francis. You can't see me today. I'm a contributing editor at Gamasutra. I am happy to be here today with you with a really cool game and a really cool GDC speaker. But I'm also joined by Chris and Alex, who, if they could please introduce themselves, I would appreciate it.
We can do it. I'm Chris Graft. I'm editor-in-chief of Gamasutra, sometimes called Gamstura.
Gamstura. Didn't Christian used to accidentally type that in stories?
It was Gamasutra. Sometimes he would switch those around.
Gamasutra. Alex, who are you?
I am Alex Waro, and I'm also an editor at Gamstura, also known as Gamasutra. Thank you to everybody for joining us. Richard, thank you so much for coming on today.
Glad to be here with the Gamstura Gamasutra
Gamasutra
clan.
We're playing a really cool game that Richard is making here. I got the title on screen for us. It's called The Church in the Darkness. Richard, how long have you been working on this game?
A couple years now. And yeah, about 2 years, 2.5 maybe. Depends how you count.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In the back here. Okay. Hey, Richard, can you please tell me and the audience who you are and what you have worked on in the past? Because I know your name from GDC, but I am not familiar with your full body of work or how you came to work on this project.
Mostly I've just given GDC talks.
And they're real good.
Professional GDC speaker, Richard Rouse III.
That's right. Oh, wait, am I supposed to be paid? Oh. Yeah, so I've been doing game stuff for a long time as game designer and writer, programmer sometimes, and various other jobs. But long time ago, I started out making Mac indie games, though they weren't called indie games then, and then moved to AAA, worked at a place called Surreal Software, where we worked on a game called Draken, and then we worked on a game called The Suffering. I was the creative director on that. Some horror games, and people still seem to remember those, which surprises me every time. And then since then, I've moved around a bunch of other places. I worked in publishing at Midway, who had acquired Surreal Software then for a while, and then I worked at Ubisoft for a while, and most recently worked at Microsoft on things like, on the publishing side, but doing sort of a design role, so working on things like Sunset Overdrive, Quantum Break, and ending up on State of Decay, which I really loved working on at the end. And then I said, what I really want to do is work all the time. So I thought, let's make an indie game. So that brings us to The Church in the Darkness.
So what is this game that I'm about to play, and I've only played for about 15 minutes prior to this?
Yeah, so it's The Church in the Darkness is as you can see from the stream, a top-down action infiltration game set inside a religious cult in the 1970s. So you are... you have a nephew who's in this cult, and the cult group has moved down to South America, and everyone doesn't know what's going on, so you're going down there to infiltrate and try to find him, and also try to figure out what's the nature of this cult. Is it actually a dangerous thing, or is it just some weird hippies who want to live in the woods and they're not going to hurt anybody? So you're trying to, and the story shifts and changes every time you play. So, and I got to do a talk about this last year at GDC at the inaugural Narrative Innovation Showcase. I believe that's what it was called. And yeah, so it's been a long year working on it since then, and still not quite done. But you're seeing the version we showed back this past fall at a few different shows. Is this build here?
Nice. We had a really cool talk about this game, you and I, a few months ago. And you were telling me you got some really cool voice actors to work on it. I turned the volume down a lot, so I don't know if our stream can hear it. But who are these two people's voices we're hearing up here?
Yeah, so I a long time ago worked with this guy John Patrick Lowry on the Suffering games that I mentioned. And he since then went on to be in even bigger games and is most known as the sniper in Team Fortress 2.
Yeah.
But has been in all of Valve's games at different points. And I've bonded with Valve guys about how cool it is working with John. So I knew when I was doing this game, I just thought he would be a great fit as a sort of charismatic cult leader type. And he was into doing it, so I was glad to hear that. But coincidentally, he's married to Ellen McLean, who's known most as being GLaDOS in Portal, and has also done a lot of other Valve games. And I said, wouldn't it be great if they were husband and wife cult leaders, and hence brought her in. And so they're husband and wife in real life, where they're not cult leaders, except at conventions when they have an ardent following. And then in the game, they're playing Isaac and Rebecca Walker, who are the leaders of the Collective Justice Mission, which is the group you're infiltrating.
Yeah, I would like to get more into how you came up with the premise of you're infiltrating a cult. But before that, you talked about procedural. Is it like procedural narrative, or can you talk about developing the systems involved there?
Yeah, I mean, I like to refer to it as equally systems and careful authorship. It really does come down to like making the content in a certain way that works with a story that can have certain elements change but still work. Yeah, so it's sorry, I just had a horrible feedback there on my machine.
Sorry, and I just got caught by the guards. They're coming after me.
Oh.
Yeah, real quick, I just want to acknowledge that there's a question in the chat from E. Klein. We'll get to your question in a second after we answer Chris's question.
Cool. So,
And I died.
in terms of how it works, there's sort of a number of different sort of starting conditions to the group, where they are, the cult leaders, Rebecca Walker, can have personalities which range from, they're always radical cult leaders, but sometimes they're apocalyptic and dangerous, and sometimes they're just eccentric, radical, like progressives. And so you're as you're infiltrating, it starts in these different states where they have these different personalities, and then you're trying to figure out what state it's in while you're playing, and then you also do the classic. You get to choose how you play the game, so you can play it violently or non-violently. And I see Bryant got captured, for example, by Isaac Walker. He like in different scenarios, he will say different things to you during this scene. He will maybe just shoot you dead while you're in the cage there. So if you've been playing the game very violently and have killed a lot of people in the town, he's going to kill you right away. But if you haven't, he'll actually leave you in the cage, and then you can break out and keep playing that game.
That's nice of him to let you.
Yeah.
Will he bring you
He's
Kool-Aid?
giving you the benefit of the doubt. When he has a certain personality, he's willing to give you the benefit of the doubt, and it sort of ends up working like an extra life in the game. Essentially. So you get to keep playing that same scenario, because it does have roguelike qualities, so that when you die, you're restarting. When you die ultimately, you're restarting the game, and you're starting in a new place with your objectives.
Because I'm doing just as...
Yeah. So the
now I died again. Sorry.
The premise of a cult. Can you talk about what inspired you to come up with the game's premise in the first place?
Yeah, cults have fascinated me for a while, and there have been some of my older games have had little bits of cults in them, and this is the first one that's really focused.
Are you in one? Real quick, are you in a cult?
I think we're all in some kind of a cult. Like the game industry is a cult, GDC is a cult. So, but it's actually, I joke about that, but I also, I worked at Microsoft, and sometimes you go to certain company functions where someone gets up and does a very charismatic rah-rah speech. And I'd say this, I'm not calling out Microsoft. I think this is true of like Steve Jobs as well. It's just, he has this very charismatic, gets people to do what he wants them to do.
Wasn't it the Steve Ballmer thing?
Right. Yeah. No, he's a really
developers.
Love him or hate him. He is a very dynamic speaker.
Oh my God! I just remember when
you can get people to follow him into the breach, right? And that's sort of what you need to be a cult leader. But I was fascinated by cults as I looked at them more. Is that they always often start off with really good intentions. Like no one thinks, "Hey, that's a cult. I'll go join." They think, "Hey, that's going to help me in this way," or "That's going to do good for the world." or that's addressing this problem that I really don't like, or in times like this, in uncertain times like this, there might be some people might see the appeal of retreating to the woods to hide out and have your own little society separate from the madness of what's going on in the rest of the world. So yeah, I was just sort of fascinated by them starting off with good intentions, and then the ones we tend to hear about are the ones where some horrible thing has happened and or a showdown with the government happened or whatever. But there's lots of cult groups that go and do their own weird thing, and then they just they do that for 20 years, and then they break up when the charismatic leader passes on naturally, or they try it for 10 years and then decide they don't want to do that anymore and go do something else. And it's just interesting to look at these from the outside, and it's hard to know which type of group you're dealing with.
Real quick, the question from E. Klein says they're from South America. Is there any place in South America that the game is inspired by?
I mean, it's set in I swore I turned off my phone. It's set in a fictitious country, but sort of on the Caribbean coast on the north of South America. So it's sort of it's like if you look at the map, it's sort of a chunk of Brazil that's been turned into Venezuela, which is the country where this is set.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely in that sort of Amazon rainforest sort of territory.
So let's talk about the anatomy of cults. Right, because you just mentioned that many what we might call cults or religious or non-religious orders, like they don't have to be bad. They can be benign. They can break up. They can cause no harm. Is it ever possible in the Church in the Darkness for someone to encounter a benign cult, or does it always go bad?
No, it doesn't always go bad. I mean, there's sort of different degrees of going bad. They're always armed. They're always hostile to you being a trespasser coming onto their land. They never just welcome you with open arms and let you go about your business with no interference from them. So it's always an infiltration, stealthy type of game.
It would be nice if they did.
Yes, that would be making 2 games though. Fine. For the aspiring game developers out there, this is a lesson in script management. I mean, they're always hostile. They're always kind of militant, but they're not always going to hurt themselves or going to hurt anybody else, right? If left alone. If left alone, they might just continue out their existence for decades. And there are different people you'll meet while you're playing the game who will be willing to talk to you and give you advice or help you find Alex, who your nephew that you're looking for. And those things change based on on how you've played the game. Because if you go in and they are actually a dangerous group, you're sort of justified in maybe taking out the guards or whatever. But if they are just a group that is trying to live their life and do their thing, and you come in and shoot a bunch of people, then you're exactly sort of the jerk from America that they always have been saying is coming to destroy them. So,
Some of you have asked
there are lots of endings where you might find Alex and decide he wants to stay. I think he's going to be okay, and you might decide to just leave him there too, and that the group can go on. So
how did your interest in cults influence the actual game's design? Like when you were laying out the ways the systems can interact and the spectrum between like hostile and apocalyptic versus benign, what did you draw inspiration from specifically?
Yeah, I mean, it is set during the 70s, which I found was a time when people were really, there was sort of an explosion of these sort of alternate ways of living and alternate groups. And Jonestown is the one that is sort of the obvious comparison that everyone brings up because that was South America. But there's other interesting ones like, Rajneeshpuram was a group that was in Oregon. There's a great documentary called The Source Family that's about this one that was in LA and then moved to Hawaii. And they actually didn't end. I mean, the leader died in sort of a weird way, but everybody else was fine and then just dispersed after that. So it's sort of an interesting, they never really did anything horrible, that group, which is probably why they're less famous, sadly. So it's there were a bunch of different groups there to look at. And sort of just looking at how so many of those groups that existed back then were reacting to what they saw as an American government that they didn't like, that they thought was not in their best interests. And I've talked to people who were alive during that period, and they often say, well, you have to remember, back then everyone was expecting like nuclear annihilation at any point, right? It was like we're all going to die any minute, so why not go do this different thing? We got to try something different. This obviously isn't working. So it's sort of the when you're that frustrated, it becomes less odd to go do something like this. So I mean, that was sort of some of the sort of narrative inspiration for the whole thing. In terms of sort of the pure gameplay, I just thought, a group that has isolated themselves into a compound in the jungle is sort of a great gameplay setting, just because it's a nice isolated space, and you can create a whole like ecosystem of people going about their lives there, and then poke it yourself as a simulation when you're infiltrating it. So it just seemed like that too was a great place to set a game, and something that could be made to work.
And your GDC talk, you're on a panel with other writers, designers. It's called Rules of the Game, another 5 techniques, particularly crafty designers. Did you come up with that one yourself? Yeah. You all will be talking about some rules and guidelines that you follow as, a lot of your job, even though you wear a lot of hats, is narrative design. Can you talk about some of the personal philosophies or guidelines that you applied, to your work on this game and just in general? Yeah.
The talk, just to sort of address both parts of that, I guess, is the talk is really a game design talk, and there's one of the speakers is doing a narrative thing. The others are more sort of pure game design or game design production issues. But yeah, sort of each year, because this is the 3rd year we've done it. So, and I sort of find 5 designers each time who each do like a 10-minute talk about one of their rules that they use in their everyday work. And usually one per year turns out to have a fairly heavy narrative component to it. But I do find, the interesting thing about that is that as designers, I think everyone has their own sort of rule book of what they think a good game is or what the type of game they want to work on is. So I think it's cool to pick someone like Christina Norman, who worked on Mass Effect and now works at Riot. It's like, what are the rules she uses to go about, working on the game she works on, and how do those apply? And then as someone going to GDC, you might see the talk and say, do these apply to what I'm working on, or do I agree or disagree? Because they're very personal rules too. They're not necessarily like everybody can use this rule, but it's still an interesting thing to discuss and learn about, even if you ultimately do something different with your own work. So for me, in terms of sort of narrative design rules, this was, the biggest one probably is really letting the player play the game the way they want to play it and experience the narrative they want to play it the way they want to experience. So that isn't just, a very linear fixed, like this is the story of the game. It's more like, here's the story space of the game, and then you can go poke it in your own ways and influence it, and based on how you play and who you choose to talk to and who you choose to help. And, do you decide to try to assassinate the cult leaders or not? And that can kind of lead to then all these different endings that we talked about. And that's sort of, for me, I'm most fascinated when game stories tell stories that you could not tell in any other medium. That isn't, like the movie version of this, would just tell one version of this story, right? Whereas here, if it's designed as a replayable game, like I said, with roguelike qualities, so that as you're replaying it, you're really seeing different things. You're making different choices, not just because you're replaying and you want to make different choices, but because the situation has changed. So you're making different choices because, I like to say often when you replay a game with choices in it, you're often forcing yourself to make the decisions you didn't want to make, because the first time you do what you want to do, and then the second time you want to see the other content, so you do the opposite of what you want to do, which is a weird feeling in some ways. So here it's like you replay it, but now the situation has changed, so you're actually making different choices. And I was just sort of fascinated with this mechanic of a story that changes, and then your choices on top of that sort of leading to these very different experiences.
Real quick,
go ahead,
2 things. One, my apologies. This cold. E. Klein is a question that I want to pull in from the chat, but I also want to remind our viewers, especially if you're coming in from the creative Twitch channel that we're, Twitch section of Twitch that we're sitting on right now. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. We'll throw them at Richard for you. If you have any questions about game design or narrative design, GDC speaking, just remember to ask them in the chat. And E. Klein would like to know why you chose the character to be the uncle and not the father of Alex. And seems they're asking about a father-son relationship as opposed to a uncle relationship.
Right. I mean, that's an interesting... I'm going to have to like dredge into my memory of why that decision was made 2 years ago. Because I'm pretty good at like, once a decision's made, forgetting about all other things that might have been done. I thought it was, I guess, the player character is really, in this type of game, is really more of a vessel for the player to do what they want to do. So you as the player character never talk, for example. So it sort of follows in that tradition of like, the original System Shock or original BioShock or other games where you're really more of a vessel. But I did want him to have a parent who was personified in the game, so that he does have a mother who you hear sort of some audio snippets of her via when you have some documents from her that will be voiced when you have them in the game, which isn't in this demo. So there is a strong relationship, like a mother-son sort of thing going on there. And then you as the player character also able to pick your gender and ethnicity as well. So it would have, it could have been like right there if you then had like, well, I can be a woman or a man, well, that's going to change my relationship with Alex in some way probably. So then I'm sort of recording like 2 bespoke sets of all this dialogue, which is like, lots of games have done that, and that's fine and interesting, but it wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do with this game.
I was gonna drop in the anecdote about like years ago, decades ago. I think Warren Spector said he wanted to try and build. His ideal project was like building a one city block out and then trying to build an RPG around that where everything was simulated perfectly, and you would have all these different stories and opportunities and things going on in this super small space.
Yes.
Because this reminds me very much of that. Then I remember that I made that exact same comparison like a week ago on the stream, so I'm just not going to do that. Because
well, it's funny. I think I was at that GDC talk where he started talking about the goal for immersive simulations, like a Deus Ex type game or a System Shock type game, being like, how could you make a really small game that is densely simulated and has a lot of choices in a small space, as opposed to, a 40-hour game where just your choices per, sort of the amount of difference you can have is lesser because you have to create this giant world. Yeah. And this, that actually did cross. That's funny you bring that up because that did cross my mind as I was in the very early stages of thinking about, because sometimes people will say, hey, do you have like, a lava world and an ice world to go with jungle world here or something? And I'm like, no, it's just jungle world. It's just this one space that we're trying to do as many interesting things as possible instead of like going super wide.
Yeah. And I feel kind of guilty for constantly bringing up that chestnut because I think a lot of designers and developers are interested in that idea. I think Spectre just happened to be the first one to say it in front of a mic. But it's gratifying to see people working these kind of projects. And I want to ask, since you are now working on this as an indie, and you got started, basically, as you said, like working on games, by yourself, or like in a small team, like how has the nature of this kind of game development changed in the last couple of years, last couple of decades even?
Yeah, it's definitely massively different. Though in both cases, I was, back when I did it early on, I was using licensed engines, sort of at the very beginning when people are doing that. So like the second game I did used the Marathon engine from Bungie's old Marathon games.
Sure.
So I've always been a fan of sort of licensed tech, and I think that's probably the biggest change that has made, having something like Unity makes making a game like this so much more possible than it would have been on a small budget, even 5 years ago or something like that. So I think that the accessibility of that and sort of the community of that, where you can go, so when I was working with the Marathon engine way back when, and this is sort of the traditional model when you would license an engine 15, 20 years ago from someone, the support that came with it was, let's say, not that extensive. It was more like, here's the code for the engine, do whatever you want. We're really busy working on a game right now, so we're not going to be able to necessarily answer every question you have immediately. Like if I had big problems, I could go to the Bungie guys and ask, but it wasn't that wasn't the true nature. That wasn't the expected nature of the relationship, like a support thing. They were like, hey, we're building games, and sure, you can use our engine. Don't ask us too many questions. Obviously, Unity's different in that they have such a huge breadth of people using it that you can go, find an answer to any question you might have. Whereas, back in the old days of engine licensing, you just dug through the code and prayed that there was some comment in there that would help you figure out what was going on, or you just gave up and rewrote it at some point. So I'd say that sort of from an implementation standpoint, that's one of the biggest differences. And certainly things like the asset store didn't really exist back then either, though we don't actually have a ton of asset store stuff in here.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big difference. And I think just the nature, I mean, back when I was doing indie games, I still had a publisher who would get the game into a store and all of that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And that was a necessary thing. Like, you just couldn't, there was no commercially viable path to releasing a game that wasn't getting it in the store. And that just, meant that doing a game, about, say, religious cults would be more difficult because the buyer at Walmart might get upset and not want to buy any of them. And then you'd just be out of business. It's like, because you would have these few gatekeepers who were much more concerned about their public image. Or we're just concerned about any sort of backlash that might happen with the video game. So I'd say that's the other sort of thing that has changed. Is just the ability to get it out yourself means you can do crazier things.
Yeah, but you're also up against the 500 other games on that particular storefront that people got out themselves that day. Does that make you nervous at all? Like the rising threat of discoverability? Yeah,
no, that's certainly something that. I mean, this is the first one I'm publishing myself in this modern era, and it's even someone who was like an expert at publishing indie games 3 years ago didn't have that same amount of problem that you have now. Yeah. And it's definitely something that doesn't. I mean, I think the sort of algorithms in Steam and whatnot do a pretty good job at surfacing the stuff that is, viable commercial product, shall we say. But it can be tough if you are, having trouble getting over that first hump in the algorithm to get like if you do have some amazing game. People always bring up the examples of a Stardew Valley or something that came out of nowhere. But are there other games that were equally cool to that just never escaped, and the people who were making it didn't have the magic, didn't know what thing to do to help improve their chances in the algorithm or whatever? I mean, that's definitely a concern, and the fact that even just among the games that are good, there's just a ton of really good games. And I think, didn't you guys run a story recently about indie gamers returning to AAA, or indie developers returning to AAA?
That was yesterday.
Yesterday, actually.
Yeah, I saw that one, and I said, "Yep." You can see. I mean, it's not like I'm not one of those people who say indie or die. Right? If you want to go make bigger products and be more stable doing it, you should totally consider working for one of the big studios. Pick carefully, because there's good ones and bad ones, but it's definitely, and I definitely think the fact that I've been doing this in a bigger team environment, learned a lot, has helped make this possible in a way that if I was fresh out of school even, I wouldn't know as much as I do that helps make this game work. So
we do have a new question from the chat. Divanorium is asking, have you played Dwarf Fortress Adventure Mode, and wouldn't something like that be a make-your-own adventure kind of thing? Random generated stuff, but focused on chat and actions.
Yes, so I am only tangentially aware of Dwarf Fortress. I find it fascinating yet terrifying.
It's a deep, dark hole.
So,
a beautiful, fantastic hole that is very cozy, but...
Yes.
Have you been down that hole, Alex?
I've looked, I've peered inside, and then I've backed away slowly.
But I do. That is an example of a game that I would agree has sort of my impression of it, at least, is that it is so simulation driven that you really are sort of creating an emergent narrative while you play, but that it isn't really given credit for doing that. People don't think of Dwarf Fortress as a narrative game, but I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there that is sort of in that space, even if people don't call it out that often.
So I kind of want to know if you're nervous about your GDC talk. I don't know, maybe that's like not something you want to talk about, but we often speak to relatively new GDC speakers, but you have, as you mentioned earlier, you've done this quite a few times. So are you at all nervous, or are you just locked? Are you ready to go?
No, it's, well, you know, it's, yeah, the first talk I did was, am I going to get this wrong? No, it was 2006. And my first child was born like a week and a half before. So it was that one I wasn't nervous about, because there was first being nervous about the child, and then there was, oh God, I've got to talk in a week. But I was actually super prepared like months ahead of time for that one. But yeah, I definitely am. I never stopped being nervous though, you know, despite this being the 12th or 13th talk I've been in or something. In that there's always that, you know, is it, because there's definitely been ones that have gone well and ones that haven't gone well. And so becoming aware of how, you know, sometimes not everything lines up like you hope it's going to line up, or your content doesn't hit with the audience like you think it is going to. And that not being entirely predictable, much like game development, right? Where you just don't know if you're, you know, hey, we're trying this really cool different thing. We hope people like it. Oh, wait, not so much. So yeah, I mean, there's still a nervousness. You know, right now I'm also preparing. You know, we're showing this game to press and at some other event type things at GDC. So right now my main concern is like making a new demo, because we're actually showing a different demo than this one at GDC, which is an interesting thing we could chat about as well with you guys. I'd be curious your take on this, that GDC in my time going it, so I think the first one I went to was like 2001 or something, has become so much more a business thing than it used to be, right? Like that it used to be you really would go to the talks, or maybe that's just because I was young and didn't have a lot of meetings to go to. But now it's like you go to GDC, and if you're lucky, you get to like 5 or 6 talks, something like that, right? Other than ones you're in or have to go to for some reason. And it's interesting that it has grown up this sort of place of doing business is sort of certainly for experienced people as much as the as sort of the great talks and content that are in it.
Yeah, it's you know, I obviously, I don't think any of us have. I guess we take meetings too as we cover it as press. But I remember going to my first GDC, which was only in 2010, and I was with a different company, and we were covering it as journalists. And I remember like being really grateful to be able to get into the conference, because it was so fascinating to hear everybody talk about all these like crazy, mind-boggling things. But also I felt a little guilty, because it really felt like game developers should be there to talk to each other and learn and go to the talks and not be worried about press. And there I was with my little press bat on, like running around doing interviews and asking questions and stuff, and like putting everyone a little bit on edge, because they knew they might be recorded. So I don't know, like, what do you, Chris? You've been doing this for a while, right? How do you feel about like the nature of GDC?
I think that a lot of it depends on how many times you've been to GDC as well, because generally, like the vast majority of new people do about this really got something out of it, and they feel like they come out of it like feeling inspired, just really gung-ho coming out of it, exhausted but really excited.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like the more that you go to it, maybe it becomes less about it loses some of its initial excitement, maybe, for some people. Sure, for me personally, and I've been going to it since, and I mean, it's part of the reason why I've been doing this job for so long, because I just find it fascinating listening to people who are so creative, intelligent, explain how they create these things that I am still enthralled with and And I mean, so for me, it always is about the panels. Though I know what you're saying also, Richard, that the networking part of it and like the business part of it as well. But yeah, I know. I mean, as GDC organizers, like, part is, networking is absolutely important. It is one of the big draws of GDC. But as people who help the event itself, we get so excited when we lock down certain talks, especially, and it really is just kind of we're putting GDC together, and because I don't know, it's still exciting for us, even for us working on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's my rambling take on GDC.
I should, of course, point out that we are owned by the same company that owns GDC, so we are pals in a business sense.
I mean, it's a cult. I mean, it's a cult, just like we were talking about.
We're literally in a cult.
Sort of a cult, yeah.
Yeah, the cult of United Business.
I should take a moment. If someone's going to GDC and say they're looking to become a narrative designer, E. Klein, the very wonderful E. Klein who's joined us in the chat, would like to know what's one of the best ways to show off your skills as a narrative designer to one of those studios that you're looking that might be at GDC.
That is a good question. All right. So there's a few things I recommend. Like, definitely going to the Narrative Summit is key, and that used to be a thing that was in a separate location like 3-4 years ago. That used to be in Austin at a different time of the year. And that was I never made it to that one. But I have been going ever since it's been in San Francisco at the same time. And that's a cool, I really like the Narrative Summit is almost my, Narrative Summit and the other summits as well are sort of part of my favorite part of the GDC at this point, because there feels like there's less meetings going on then usually, and there's more meetings later in the week, and there's more like stuff going on later in the week. And earlier you can just sit and go to a few talks before, and I find that those talks are super well attended, and later in the week it'll be more sporadic how well stuff is attended. Mm-hmm. I think there's also just a ton more content later in the week. So anyway, going to the Narrative Summit, that's the first 2 days. That's a good baseline. There's a great Narrative Summit hangout that happens every night. If you want to go to that, they do a thing called Write Club there. That's a sort of hilarious writing competition.
Write Club is great. That's what it's got me into the business.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah. So like that's definitely recommended, and that's a good place to, it's usually in a bar type environment, though drinking certainly not required. But it's a great place to just meet other people like yourself and meet some people who have jobs and some people who are, various levels of experience will go to that. And it's a great place to just sort of network and meet a lot of folks. It's sort of like, I would say, other people may have different opinions, but I would less approach it as like trying to put your resume into people's hands while you're there, but just more like making that first connection and hanging out and talking about why you like narrative games or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then maybe getting a card and then following up later and saying, hey, I am on if you hear of anything or whatever, just after you've, hung out with someone at some event like that or other events, it can be a great entree later. Is everybody okay out there?
Yeah, your host is... Your host is Trey. Trey sick. Oh, très mal.
The host needs a sneeze button. Do you have a sneeze button?
A sneeze emoticon.
We should also talk about
it's interesting, Richard. When you're talking about that, the idea of, I think a lot of young people or people new to the industry or events should heed those wise words that it's, shoving the resume into somebody's face. There are places at conferences, to do that in like a professional way. And there are some places where it's just about hanging out and then, just getting to know each other. I feel like a lot of people who come they try different techniques that actually turn people off, that they would like to and build a relationship where they kind of turn them off because maybe too aggressive or just like make kind of a situation awkward. And it's like, it's difficult because not everybody of natural social skills, in those situations. But I think it's more about like the Right Club. I've been to one of those in Austin, and they would hold them at the Ginger Man bar down here, and that really is a situation that it's great because, and this is why I like the Narrative Summit folks so much, is because they're really welcoming and really dating. So you can, even if you're like brand new and you hadn't done, for example, and you don't know anyone there, it's like a big welcoming group and everyone's just winging it, and then when you're in a situation like that at a conference, then things kind of then you like organically network and then get to know one another, and then a business card is exchanged or something as well. You have fun and you might learn something.
And it's great when if you didn't like the talks during the day, maybe you saw someone's talk you liked, then you can then look for them at the event that night and talk to them about their talk and stuff. Not talk to them about how you want a job right now, but just say like, hey, I loved your talk and this thing you said and whatever, and what do you think about this and stuff. And I think everybody who does the talks at the Narrative Summit is super into that sort of discussion.
One thing I got out of the Right Club was that it was one of the first times that I'd actually, it was because Richard Dansky runs around with Richard Dansky and Toya Finley, and nowadays Alexander Bevier are the three people who help set that up. And one of the things they do is they give you an opportunity to try out game writing prompts that I don't think a lot of people necessarily think like they'd get to try. Like you think being a game writer means sitting down and coming up with like letting your brain explode with this wonderful set of ideas. And in reality, it's name this nonsense thing for this nonsense function so that your systems designer can have this thing work, and so that the player doesn't feel too confused by this.
And then say the same thing 5 different ways, all interesting.
Yeah.
That can be repeated randomly.
Yeah, 5 barks. 5 barks for a guard in your fish watering game or something.
Right.
That was what blew me away about my first encounter there.
Yeah.
So, what if somebody maybe can't get to GDC this year? Is there a way you might, how would you recommend they showcase their abilities as a budding narrative designer to potential employers? E. Klein is asking what kind of work samples can I show to somebody, like maybe a Twine game or a script or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the in-engine idea is great. I see his question about that of like, because you'll get a lot of samples when you're hiring for writer positions of like screenplay type things of like, hey, this works as a screenplay, which is great. Like and it's good to see. That is relevant experience, right? I'm not discounting it entirely, but seeing like here's something either that's in script form, but that you look at it as an experienced narrative person and know, yes, I see how this would be implemented, right? Or something that's already been implemented, like Twine is great, like the various RPG games that let you create your own quests in them are great, like Bethesda Tools or whatever, or some of the simpler game systems like Game Maker, whatever it is, showing something like, hey, I made a thing that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and works and is interesting to play, and it's maybe very focused in scope, but it's the quality is apparent. I think something implemented is great, but it really does vary, and it is tough to break into sort of the bigger studios you're thinking of. But the other thing to do is just ask, right? So if you want to apply to Bethesda or you want to apply to Obsidian or something, they usually have what they're looking for in their samples on their website, and you'll want to, particularly for one of those bigger studios that get tons of applicants, you'll want to follow whatever they're asking for, because if you don't, that proves you're not paying attention to detail, and you probably won't be a good employee either, and that's just easy way to get discounted. But if you go in there and say, wow, Obsidian wants a demo of a real level in this engine, I should go do that and put real time into it. And even if you don't end up getting hired, it's still great experience, and you can put it in your portfolio for other jobs and stuff, because it's not totally throwaway. But even smaller companies you might pair up with, just if they don't list it, just ask like, hey, I'm a writer, what sort of samples would you really want to see, and then do your best to do that.
Richard, one question. How often do you wind up using Microsoft Excel in this kind of work? 'Cause that was one of my big surprises in learning about the field and doing some work in the field, was learning to be a creative writer in Microsoft Excel, which is not what you think of when you think of creative writing.
Right. I have. I mean, I use Excel a lot, but more for game design stuff. I've resisted the Excel demon as a creative writing tool, but I'm certainly rare. Like a lot of people have not successfully resisted it because, the producer or whatever said, no, that's what we're doing. Get used to it, and you can't. I mean, it's not unbearable, but it's definitely for me. It's a tricky. Yeah, it just doesn't feel like a thing that flows as a narrative tool.
Do your tools?
Yeah, definitely lots of teams do that.
Do your tools, and you're lucky that you've gotten to use proprietary tools, licensed tools, and open source tools. Do you feel like your tools ever influence your work as much as the source material of like a cult, for instance?
Sure. I mean, if you have a framework of how your conversation works that's already implemented, you should be writing things that go into those slots and not things that don't. Because if you're writing things that don't work with whatever system you're using, they're not going to get used. So yeah, definitely there is a back and forth between like what is the tech of however we're presenting the story to people working, and then how can I fit my narrative into that in the most efficient way possible versus, hey guys, I wrote this 3-page script of how I want this scene to go. You guys figure out how to implement it. That usually doesn't work out super well, and they'll just cut your stuff and implement half of it, but not the half you want, or something like that. And if you're not involved in that discussion or involved in implementing it yourself, which a lot of people don't realize that as a game writer, you're often like in a tool hooking up lines to things yourself in a scripting language of some sort. So it's not all just romantic, like I just come up with the ideas or something, right? So yeah, it's definitely working with those things is key to actually getting, the narrative into the game and not just narrative that exists in a script or something.
It was interesting listening to what you were saying about when you're answering the question about if somebody's kind of, looking for jobs and things like that. When you're at an event, and then when I'm at an event as a journalist that's covering the game industry, people will a really good way to show a reporter or a journalist, if you spot one, is like it really helps if you have a mobile game, for example, like because I've seen some like really cool, interesting stuff, and that's like a really big advantage if you're working on something that you can show off on like an iPad, or
right, you can just whip out of your pocket.
You just like take it out. It's like, oh, that's neat. Or maybe it's not neat. I can still stand there with my beer and be like, okay. But thank you for showing that. No, I've never liked that. I always have an open ear. Yeah. But yeah, like the mobility, even if it's a laptop, showing a reporter just like what you have going, and you can find some really cool, interesting. You can the reporter can find really cool, interesting stuff that way in an event. So I would encourage people, if the environment is conducive to that, then sure. Like I love checking out games and seeing what people are working on.
And certainly like at one of those nighttime hangouts when you're meeting new people, even if they're just other, people like you who are aspiring or whatever, being able to say, what are you working on? Oh, this thing, you want to see it? And then they, if that sort of things, people will happily spend 10 minutes poking at your game or doing your twine or whatever it is, I find.
What's interesting is the overlap, I think, between job hunting and trying to get your game covered is oftentimes you're sort of asking yourself, how can I help this person solve a problem they have? Because I think, speaking personally, from even just trying to get people, even just inviting people onto the stream to talk with them, obviously we're trying to do our best to explore the width and breadth of game design and talk to people from all over who have different experiences and different things. But there are often problems that like I'm trying to solve just to get this stream running. That if your game, if your experience can help make that happen, that's the kind of thing that like gets one person's game on this kind of show over another. Which kind of is like somehow we started talking about how to market your game to journalists, which I know we've got a few talks about by accident. But like I just think it's interesting that like a lot of the interactions I've had at events like GDC come back to problem solving. Like, we're trying to solve problems in our games, and we're trying to solve problems with our stories, and we're trying to solve problems about interacting with each other, because we're all trying to help each other, because we're kind of, an inclusive group of people. At least I like to think so.
Right. And I definitely think there was one other, going back to something that came up earlier about, like, what if you can't go to GDC? Because, yeah, obviously GDC is in San Francisco, and maybe you're not, and it's expensive to go, even if you're in San Francisco. But definitely wherever you are, I find there's often tons of free events that you can go to, like IGDA meetups or indie game clubs or whatever, and those will actually be... You'll be able to have longer conversations with people at those events because it's not GDC. They're not running off to some meeting. They're not, meeting 100 people they haven't met before in the last hour or something. So going to those local events and then saying, oh, what did you see at GDC, or what did you do this? And then often, there's a lot of free content on the vault and stuff like that you can go check out. That's another place you can just get sucked into of just all these interesting things you didn't manage to see at the show. That can allow someone who maybe can't make it to San Francisco to go still get a lot of that value out of there, and then go hang out with other people who are interested in making games in their area, whatever form that might be.
This is definitely the part where we need to disclose that aside from Richard, all of us here on the do work for the same organization as GDC. So we are talking nicely about it. But
forget the small events. Come to GDC. No, but it's true. I just went to Fuegos Rancheros last night, and it's something that they hold in Austin. And the advantage with those is that they don't only happen once a year also. So you'll start seeing familiar faces, and that there's a lot of different ways to get plugged into your local game development community. Then you can learn some faces and learn some names. You'll learn each other's work and what they're doing. And I mean, I definitely see around here people jumping, if something with their job falls through, or they want to move somewhere else, and then just through these social / super casual business, not even really business, just hangout events, are really partaking in your community, especially in person, if you're in a place that allows that, is extremely helpful.
Yeah, there was one guy, and when you're going to those events too, try to figure out who's who at them, who are the senior developers versus who are the other students, and just so you know who you're talking to. And there was actually one sort of success story, I guess, a guy who introduced himself to me at the Seattle equivalent of that Austin event, the Seattle Indies meetup. He introduced himself to me a year ago, maybe, but he knew, he was like, "Oh, you're Richard. You're working on the Church in the Darkness, blah blah blah." And then he had something, he'd looked at the trailer we'd released or whatever, and we talked about it. And I could immediately tell that he was a smart dude who was into literature and into history and stuff, and we were able to talk about the game in really interesting ways. And he just got, and I think he was working in web development or something at the time. He then got a web development job at ArenaNet, which is a studio here in town, makes games, but still not a writing job. But I knew he was always aspiring to be a writing job, and he just got a job at Telltale
nice.
A few weeks ago. So, and as a sort of an entry level narrative designer. So that was, and I could tell that he was, just always very chill when we would talk, and would be aware of who was who at these parties, and have interesting things to say to everybody. So that's the kind of skill that can then translate to doing a really good job interview, or asking those people, "Hey, I'm applying to Telltale. What advice do you have?"
Once we send you out of here, come back.
Have interesting things to say to everybody.
At all times.
And treat everyone respectfully. You just said it there.
Yes.
Treating everyone, don't act like you're better than everyone there, because you never know when that person may wind up being the person you need a job from.
Right.
I know that we're running out of time here, but I do want to ask a question. I've been thinking about it, and I saw it in a write-up from your talk last year, 6 points about game narratives, and one of them is, I wanted to talk about this because it's drama management, and it's kind of I love this idea, and also we have an upcoming feature from the guy who led development on Planescape Torment, and it's kind of about the game being a really good DM of a tabletop RPG. Can you talk about drama management real quick? Because I'd just like to squeeze that in here.
Yeah, it's one of the great sort of undiscovered countries of game narrative, and that not a lot of games have done it. So Facade is often the example people bring up of something that took a bunch of events that the player might be driving and then would try to shape them into something that felt like a real story and say, hey, we're having a peak moment now, let's make sure a low moment happens next, and would spawn in things accordingly based on that. The other example, it's sort of a commercial example, is Shadow of Mordor's Nemesis system, where it would take like just your hunt for some random NPC that would be the most boring thing in the world, but then just elevated it by populating in all this cool content and a unique name and like a unique helmet and a weird cutscene that it would do and stuff. So not a lot of games have done it, but it is, and it's like a lot of narrative, sort of procedural narrative stuff. It could get really complicated and hard. But I think the Nemesis system was smart because it actually did just very simple things and then filled the pipeline with good content in a way that then produced this result that was really resonant with people, despite it not actually doing that much. Like from like a AI research standpoint, it's not like some amazing reinvention of all game narrative, but it's like cool enough that it became like the signature feature of that game, and obviously had was a huge part of that game's success. So yeah, I mean, I think, it's drama management is one of the things I encourage people to keep playing with, because I don't feel like we've done everything we could do with it yet.
Yeah. All right, and it's time. Let me begin the closing ceremonies. Well, thank you all for wasting another perfectly good hour listening to the Gamasutra crew chat with smart and interesting people. I'm Brian Francis, contributing editor to Gamasutra, the anonymous voice in your ears. Chris and Alex have joined us, the two other sterling editors from Gamasutra. And Richard, your game is called what, and where can people find out about it?
Game is called The Church in the Darkness, and you can find it on Twitter at Church Darkness, or Facebook, just search for Church in the Darkness, or go to the website at paranoidproductions.com/church, and there's a mailing list and assets and trailers and all sorts of stuff.
Sounds like a cult to me.
Sounds like a cult.
Hopefully. I'm aiming to be the cult game about cults.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you all for joining us. As we've said multiple times in the stream, Gamasutra and GDC are sibling organizations under UBM Americas. If you want to know more about Richard, where you can find Richard at GDC, look down below on our Twitch page and you'll see a link to Richard's talk. Just click that and you can get more details. Other than that,
at 5 p.m. on Wednesday, everybody.
Yeah, 5 p.m. on Wednesday. We also hope you will subscribe to the Twitch channel so that we can bring you other interviews from great folks. I'm actually talking to Richard Dansky right now about trying to get him on, but we're still trying to lock down details on that. So if you want to hear more narrative stuff, hopefully you can ask some questions of the man who writes Tom Clancy things himself now. The new Tom Clancy, you might say, because he's literally in charge of it over at Red Storm. Anyway, have a good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.